Here we go.
Hello. The act of allowing public universities to pursue financial autonomy entails allowing universities to control how the subsidies the government gives them are allocated. It entails the university deciding how the subsidy would be allocated into which department, which faculty, and what kind of extracurricular activities they want. We believe that the act of the Ministry of Higher Education pushing for public universities to give them financial autonomy entails two problems. Firstly, the university can spend in a way that directly benefits them. May probably feel that certain department or certain faculties in the university is better for them based on poll rankings or whatsoever, and decide to fund that faculty even more, even if that faculty is not needed for Malaysia's development as a country. And secondly, it is the removal of the government's accountability on education. It reduces the burden the government has to pay in education, because right now, most of the burden in terms of the quality of education goes directly towards the university. We regret that suggestion, be rather the previous suggestion on how the government has the financial autonomy. So this is the stance basically of our side and the policy that happened in the past. Firstly, for the government to continue having financial autonomy over the universities, this means that the government can control where the subsidies and where the money are going to be channeled to, which faculty, what kind of activity whatsoever. Secondly, we will argue that the funds could be allocated in a way that benefit all parties and races of students in Malaysia. And thirdly, we would like to emphasize that although the government has financial autonomy over where to fund, we don't think the government will not have autonomy over the nitty-gritty like syllabuses of that particular subject that they are funding to. Those are the syllabuses that should be directly conducted and determined by the university themselves. What the government is doing, what the Ministry of Education is doing, is basically deciding which faculty they want to fund it. So our goal is simple. Yeah, we're going to prove why on the comparative, we promote a better growth of Malaysia in the long run. So two arguments coming from us. Firstly, the nature of Malaysia and why the Ministry of Education is in the best position to have financial autonomy. And secondly, why there's more accountability being placed on the Ministry of Education and Malaysian government. So firstly, nature of Malaysia. As a developing nation, there are certain courses that are required for the development of the country. So for example, in the 1990s, when Malaysia was experiencing high economic growth, Malaysia needed a lot of engineers rather than people like studying liberal arts courses. This meant that the Malaysian government continuously pumped funding into engineering courses in order to fulfill those kind of economic growth desires. Also, we would want to emphasize that it is often the government that has the best data or the information on which sectors of the economy requires the most amount of human capital. So for example, right now, Malaysia's services industries are increasing exponentially. This means that the government has data on how social sciences students need, like there needs to be more social sciences students in Malaysia. But here is the problem that they have to defend. When you give the universities financial autonomy, the universities will often act in a way to directly interest them the most and spend that subsidy in their way. So for example, USM is really good in marine biology. Their QS world ranking is like really high and top ranking in the world. However, we need to recognize, and this is like a truth in Malaysia, the field of marine biology is not one that is most needed by Malaysia in this moment in time. However, at the point in which you give them absolute funding, the uni's interest obviously to fund that industry, fund that faculty, because they want that faculty to continuously rise among the world university rankings. So we believe that the solution is outside the government can correct this. Because right now, we channel most of the funding towards unis and ask them to fund certain faculties even more. And we would argue that this is better for the country, because at least we are funding on courses that we know will directly benefit the countries in the long run. But more importantly, this is the better use of government funding, because we need to recognize that Malaysia at this point in time has quite limited government finances. We are running a budget deficit. Given how scarce the money that we have right now, it is best to spend in a way in which directly benefits the country in the long run. To spend in a way that the human capital can be used to raise our growth in the long run. So on those kind of grounds, our side promotes better growth for Malaysia if the Ministry of Education has financial autonomy. Sure.
Right, so those parts of the economy that are severely lacking are areas where you have a high demand for workers. Universities now have to balance their budgets. Why doesn't that financial incentive mean that they redirect funds to those areas?
But I don't think universities always have that incentive. Like unis normally care for you for the years in which you are in there. They don't really care about like the long run of the country. I'll explain more on this right now. So let's talk about the accountability that's being placed on the government. Problem number one is when you pass financial autonomy towards universities, it reduces the burden on governments. And secondly, we need to recognize that Malaysia right now has an issue of graduates reportedly not ready for the industry. There are cases where they probably supposedly do not have practical skills or they do not speak English whatsoever. If the Ministry of Education shift the burden and give financial autonomy towards the universities, any problems associated with the quality of the students can be shifted to the universities. This means that there will be a nuance that is not the government that failed to teach you, but it is the universities that failed to do so. Why is it important that governments have a burden? Firstly, we argue that it's often the people that voted in, and obviously everyone in this country wants people to receive the best form of education. But secondly, we would argue that the byproducts of university students directly benefits the country. So therefore, if the government can provide funding and teach students in a way in which people become more high skilled and more productive, that entails economic growth. So why is it good that governments are directly tied? Because they will channel the money in a way which promotes holistic growth and basically fund on activities that directly benefits the country. Second, we argue that there's more pressure on the government, because let's assume if the government does fail in producing really good education, there will be public resentment, and we would argue that governments obviously want to reduce all those kind of things, and therefore they would try their best to fund in the best way possible. But thirdly, all political parties in Malaysia would definitely focus on how they want to fund universities and how they want to allocate universities funding on different faculties. This is important because right now in Malaysia's political arena, the idea of education isn't brought into the forefront of discourse and discussion as much as possible. If the Ministry of Education does become an arbiter in determining how a university spends their money, all political parties at stake would harp on the idea of education and how they want to provide a better education for people.
We thank the Prime Minister and we invite the Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear.
Please note that before I continue on our argumentation, we are not asking government universities to change into a form of private universities to be privately managed. We are just trying to allow or give private universities an opportunity to have an alternate source of finance, not directly only relying on the government to sponsor them with all the money. Before I move on, I would like to give a few rebuttals. Right, the government clearly states that private universities will misuse their finance that they have by choosing what courses that they want to do go themselves and things like that and further on. We think that this is okay because this will reduce the slight miscommunication that they might have within government, because government's agenda might link with the university's agenda. However, the way they achieve it might be different. So we think that it is more profitable and it's more better for the university themselves to decide how they want to achieve this agenda that the government set. So the government still has a say in these private universities and how they go, what kind of targets, what kind of agendas they're supposed to achieve. We're just trying to say that private universities can have their own methods in towards achieving it. Now, another thing that I would like to argue is that this reduces the burden. Oh, thank you. This reduces the burden on a government has on to support the private university, because the private university will be able to fund themselves and to be able to compete on a global market, which I'll get into in my points later. Now, lastly, the government clearly stated that having a high ranking in globally is a really good thing. We agree with this thing. However, there are criteria needed for you to achieve this global ranking. What are the criteria needed? Okay, how employable are your graduates? That is one of the criteria. How well you're doing, what kind of market that you are contributing on a global scale. These are metrics that the institutes use to rank your university, and we think that for universities to reach those rankings, they need to manage themselves and to be able, allow them to be able to compete on a global market. Now, moving on. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to accept the globalization of the world. We have to accept that Malaysia is moving on to a global stage. We cannot just cater our graduates towards a local market, because a lot of government universities are currently still catering towards the local market. Their graduates are still doing jobs locally. We have to compete globally. We need the incentive and we need the money and funds needed for us to compete globally. Now, we are not trying to change the core value of the university. The university can still be what it was. It can still be what it is when it was implemented. We're just giving them more finance for them to help them push themselves towards a global market. Now, note that when a private university, when a government university will be financially autonomous, we are not trying to say that we will charge horrendous amounts towards students coming to the university and etc. Which I'll move on.
Clarification.
Okay, before I move on.
How autonomous will your universities be, and what are the benefits of the autonomy? How autonomous will your universities be, because it's not clear, and what are the benefits of this autonomy?
Alright, I'm getting on to that now. Next point, how autonomous will the university be? Because the university doesn't necessarily need to charge students only as the only source of income, or rely on the government's funds to provide them the only source of income. Here are three things that universities can do, and it is a good thing to do to have different finances. One is that they can promote their universities to allow companies to buy share within the university. This also provide benefits for the students studying in the university, because they can have programs to just immediately after they graduate, they can just work on a global stage, global market, which is contributing towards Malaysian market to compete on a global scale. Secondly, universities can advertise towards other corporations to fund student projects. Now, we know that in universities, there are a lot of different innovative ideas that are birthed within universities, and these ideas are usually not implemented enough or not funded enough. We think that with the funds that private corporations can provide towards these universities, we'll be able to fund student projects and also get a better benefit of the income towards university and towards a betterment of Malaysia. Right. Even if we are doing this, there's still a restriction on how much. Even if there will definitely be a restriction on how much we can go, because we need the university still need to align to the government's agenda. It doesn't necessarily mean that they'll just trample over the agenda and don't care about it. We're just saying that they have we are not centralizing the thing. We're just decentralizing. We're just letting the university manage their own finance. However, towards the end purpose is still the same as the government. So thank you. Now, one thing I would like to state that the duty of the Malaysian Higher Education Institute is to provide the optimal standard of every school. So that means that we have to provide the best standard of every school. Now, we know that private universities, their standards are raising more and more because, let's just say, enrollment fees are getting more and more expensive, so that this allows them to compete on a global stage. We think that if we have to give the chance for government universities to also compete on this global stage, which is why we need autonomy on university. And we think that government institutes, the Ministry of Higher Education's purpose is to provide optimal standards. So in the sense that, regardless of the political purpose here, I mean, without a political agenda behind it, that is what we have to do. Thank you. Right. So what are the optimal standards that we need? Optimal standards that we need to achieve is like the need of money, the need of financing that government university needs. Now, one another point I would like to argue is the opportunity cost of other sectors of the society. We think that if we think that the government universities that are autonomous, they will be able to cut the opportunity cost of the government. How does this go? Because the money that's supposed to be sponsored towards these universities can be allowed to further on in our private sector, like helping the Bumi Putras, or helping the poverty people, or helping the poorer people to build a better livelihood, and to funnel in this money to welfare. Now, process to autonomous being allowed to run themselves. Another thing that raised up is when a university really needs this money for a major problem, the government will be able to provide this stuff because their burdens are lifted. They don't really have that much burden to provide cash to the university. So when a university needs a really important things that they really need the cash, the government will be able to provide that with that purpose.
Thank you, Minister for position. And we invite the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Yes. There's the burden that when they said this, we will sell shares, we will reduce funding, we will ensure some level of privatization happen. Just means public universities all over the world, all over Malaysia, become private universities. Without any justification on the benefits. We think that once you have a shareholder who controls the boardroom was never explained in hello. Will the government still have autonomy, or the shareholders have autonomy? We're still confused. The reason why you need to answer that is because that raises big questions on what direction the university will take in continuing forward. Few lines of rebuttal before I move on to questions that need to be answered. Number one, the LO was very happy to shift funds away from education and then bring to welfare. That means that you should still be able to sustain a university at the same quality. So either you're trading off quality, or you're going to charge students a much higher price. We don't think it's fair on either. They target the lowest common denominator and should be as accessible as possible. But secondly, if it means that you're going to reduce your quality, and you already say private universities have an upper hand, how will your government universities have any hand in your scenario? We tell you they will lose out, and that's why they cannot win. Secondly, they talk about how you have private groups and NGOs funding group projects of students. We don't think that's mutually exclusive. Government universities can also apply to NGOs, they can still also apply to private corporations like Deloitte, and still take part in their tournaments and still ask them for some level of funding. We don't think that is mutually exclusive in any way. The question that you need to answer is who controls the direction of universities in Malaysia today. We say government universities should still continue doing so. Why? 4 important questions that need to be raised. Number 1, what creates the best Malaysian education system? Number 2, how you remove education from the political arena and why that's problematic? And number 3, what is the principle behind a Ministry of Higher Education? And lastly, it's not a brain drain and UNB cost. A lot of rebuttal will be integrated. First question, what creates the best Malaysian education system? This is premised on the fact that Malaysia is a developing nation and education oftentimes will make us or break us. So oftentimes we decide if we go in and become a developed nation with high GDPs and better accessibilities and comfort for everyone, or we go down and spiral into either inflation or some form of economic recession. We think that the government is in a more strategic position than universities themselves. This is what we contend. We think, number one, governments have a more of an incentive to ensure that graduates come out robust, but also have an incentive to ensure that they are employable, right? Because if you are the one deciding, and you are also the people who have the monopoly on who takes part in the government sector jobs, right? You often want to make these two ends meet. If you can fund education into a job spec that you as a government require very heavily, and you also give them jobs after they graduate, within that sort of symbiosis is very important to go forward. But more so, what do governments have that oftentimes public universities don't have? Governments have the ability to get data. Governments have the ability to hire think tanks. Governments have significantly more amounts of money, more amounts of leverage, more amounts of individuals that they can target through their questionnaires and through their research teams compared to public universities on their own. The benefit of this is governments will be in a more strategic position to make decisions for the public universities in comparison to public universities making them on their own. You have to come forward and tell me how public universities can ever keep up with the amount and the strength of government of the day with lesser funding, lesser influence, and lesser people willing to bend their back backwards for you. So we think it is very clear that with the data that we have, governments can oftentimes make better decisions for public universities to ensure better graduates. Before I move on, how can I help you?
Why does your policy have to be on a controlling level? Why can't the government just request if there's need?
So I think we don't like taking soft answers. We think if we honestly believe that governments making decisions for universities is the best way forward, we would like more control from the government. And my earlier argument told you the reason they can make better decisions is because the data that they have and the ability for them to galvanize help and power from other institutions. Please take it. Secondly, how do you remove education from the political arena? Your world and what will the politics be happening in your world, especially with the upcoming election, will be, should we continue with this policy or not? Should we fund or not? What we prefer in our world when there's a continuation fund from the governments themselves is politicians to be forced to discuss what roles government should play in setting syllabuses or what roles government should play in terms of funding. You negate or you reduce the discussion. And what we think is more important here is who are these voters of the upcoming developing world, or oftentimes the majority of young adults like you and me. We think there needs to be a symbiosis also with politicians and us. Because oftentimes politicians are unfortunately don't really pander to teenagers because we don't look like the majority. And we oftentimes are very politically, we don't really care about politics because we think it does not significantly affect us. We think we change that, or at least we maintain that. And governments and opposition parties are forced to discuss how public universities go forward. There is some level that reduces political apathy and then invites more and more teenagers, more and more young adults like you and me to take part in the discourse. We think it's very important because only we know what is important for the world of tomorrow, and only they know how it is strategic for us to get there. We think that relationship needs to happen. You dull the relationship down because governments can easily sidetrack this discussion very easily, and politicians will never have an incentive to discuss these policies. Thirdly, what are the principles behind being a Ministry of Education? This is premised on the fact that we believe the ministry must be as involved as possible in matters regarding education. The threshold that we set is if it's more beneficial than harmful, that the Ministry of Education has more autonomy and has complete autonomy, or as much as autonomy as possible, we think it's beneficial. How do you win this principal point if you have to prove to us that it is actually harmful for the Ministry of Higher Education to take on the burden of this? As we told you the benefit through my first argument and through Kenneth's speech, right? How the governments are very well invested, how governments have more data. All these sort of things means that governments are in a more strategic position than your public universities, and in principle, because they have that the symmetry of power and the symmetry of information, they are in the best strategy to do so. Lastly, brain drain. In the worst case scenario, because we were willing to have a very negotiable debate here. But in your worst case scenarios, when government have no control, and universities feel that they want to just get the most amount of money possible by giving courses that might seem easy or might seem popular and not be beneficial for the state, like what Kenneth told you, what oftentimes forces students to do in Malaysia is leave the country and seek jobs elsewhere. Because there is no scope for the job here, because the governments weren't intertwined and weren't ready to prepare for the sort of jobs we wanted them to do. On a comparison, the governments here had to do two things, and we think we'll do these two things well, right? make sure that the education is sufficient, but make sure there are jobs afterwards. And that sort of relationship ensures a better developing Malaysia. I've really never been prouder to propose.
Thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his speech. And we invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Two issues in this speech. Firstly, government spending and the process of actually becoming financially autonomous. Secondly, independence and innovation in Before that, I just want to get rid of this argument that doesn't really mean about political discussions and others. I think this is firstly largely a red herring in this debate, given that it's just supposed to explain that youth are becoming more not caring as much within politics. I mean, this is just one issue. There's still other issues that is the root cause of this problem. I'm not sure why we need to zero it down to just exactly this issue. But secondly, presumably there's still into the student bodies that are likely to have lively discussions as to how the university is investing sums of money within that university. I think that that's something that is still relevant in this debate and means that young people are still able to engage in discourse as to how effective it is. In fact, I would like to think that it's more effective when you're discussing between universities as opposed to when you're having discussions like trying to create changes in parliament. I think you're more likely to get change when you're that close within that university and speaking on that level. I think that that is important. On the two issues, firstly, government spending and the process to which we get financially autonomous. I think what is important to note is that, PM told us that Malaysia is in a recession, the economy isn't doing too well. I don't know if you've noticed, I'm not from around here, but I'm going to take that premise and admit that the economy isn't doing too well. On those grounds, I think they lose out in this debate. Why? Because knows that the government is then funding large sums within these universities. I think that that is something that's important to note, that the government is bleeding resources in ensuring that these universities are able to cope well. That is a high opportunity cost on other things that the government is able to do. What we think we're able to ensure on our side is that we free up the budget to an extent. That means that the government is able to invest in things that they deem to be necessary on that system. But that is just the best case of how these things go on. I think in reality it's worse than that. What is more likely to happen is that universities are seen as a means of getting money. Things such as nepotism, unneeded staff within those universities, start pumping up staff, trying to get as much resources as possible. You might need 10 chemistry lecturers, but getting way more than you need necessary because you want to get many funding to those people at the point in which you can believe that the government is definitely going to give you those resources. That means that in this debate, the idea that Mission told us that we're going to somehow have to trade off policy to a large extent isn't true. Because the process of actually becoming financially autonomous means that the university is forced to cut corners in many of these instances. They are forced to actually become more financially prudent and fiscally responsible. That means that you no longer get those unneeded staff on your side of the house, and that's a huge cost that is saved on the part of these universities. I don't think this debate has to take place in a world in which we have to actually cover up for billions in this debate, because if you consider the extent to which money is usually wasted within many of these institutions, it means that you actually save more money from actually becoming more prudent. In combination with all the things we told you from LO on how you're more likely to get more private investment into this university. But to engage with that point on how private investment then means that you can no longer operate as a public university. I think what is important to point out at this point in this debate is that the fact that you're getting many of this investment doesn't mean that you're going to now be for profit. Public universities are still going to be operated as non-profit. That means like you can't do things like what ABU does, which is trying to get as much resources as possible, right? On our side of the house, these public universities will still want to get some money, but money that is sufficient in ensuring that the university is running and running prudently. Look, we don't have to go all out and say that these universities are not going to have any funding at all. I think even if we can defend a world in which we are becoming far more prudent and becoming less of a burden on the government, that's a world in which the government is able to help out in instances where this help is needed, right? But I'll engage secondly on my second aspect. compared to opposition and not assume that we are going to become financially autonomous in just one day. I think it's going to be a process and a way in which we are able to slowly become more financially autonomous on our side of the house. On the second issue on independence and innovation in university, right? I think what is important to note is that the argument they gave us on blog that universities allocate based on ranking, I think for this argument to fly in this debate, they need to also compare it to the plausible criteria by which the government is going to actually allocate funding on your side of the house. I don't buy that it's the case that the government is going to be like, let's just give funding to some nice area, right? Because first of all, the government also cares about things like you maintaining your public university within those rankings. That same incentive still applies on this side of the house. I'm still engaged in this argument a bit more in my case. Two things here. Firstly, I think strings are likely to be attached when resources are given from the government. You can't just tell me that the government is going to just give resources and that's all, right? They would want certain things back from the universities, right? That means universities are less likely to be independent on your side or function in ways in which they can actually say no in times where are necessary to that government. I think it's better on our side where if the government is asking for something that you don't want to do as a university and you're not consistently reliant on that government, you're able to say no and do things that you believe is actually right. I'll explain why the university is likely to do things that are right. But I just want to point out that things such as graduating and not being able to speak English or the syllabus being actually changed on your side is more likely because now the government is actually interested and actually giving funding. They are the ones that are more likely to insist on Malay. They're the ones that are more likely to insist on changing syllabuses to things that are actually different. That means the very problem you identify on your side is more likely when the government is actually involved. Secondly, innovation before that.
Speaker, why do your financial investors and your shareholders give money with no strings attached more than governments?
I don't know, maybe to gain favors or whatever reason possible. I mean, there can be philanthropic reasons for actually giving resources or giving resources to be seen as an organization that is doing something good, actually what we say in status quo. And if you're a company that is seen as helping out, you're more likely to be patronized by people. I don't know, there are mountains of reasons why they're likely to do so. Secondly, on innovation, I think universities are not pushed to attract people on your side of the house. So I'm a final year student in APU, and constantly they push us to submit our CVs to companies, actually invite companies in there just to make sure that you get employed at the point in which you've already graduated. The reason for this is because they want to maintain a statistic of actually being a university that pushes people and ensures that all their graduates are actually employed. I think you're not likely to get this when a university doesn't have to compete for actually attract students, but can simply rely on government funding. I think that that's something that's important in this debate. You're more likely to get innovative stances by universities at the point in which they can't just simply expect to get resources. That's why the argument we got from PM doesn't exactly make sense. Because if you have areas in the economic sector that need a lot of workers, that's a demand for people to actually work within those areas. I think that's an incentive for universities to want to shift and divert funding to many of these areas to ensure that people actually get into those areas. I'm extremely proud of this.
We thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition, and we invite the government with. Yeah.
Testing. I don't think side opposition understands what getting favors mean. When they talked about how private universities are funded by their own selves, by investors, by shareholders, and when we ask them why as to they really need this to be privatized to this extent, they talked about investors getting favors. So I don't see how in their world and all the benefits that they accrue, or how them being principally consistent as to how they can prove that they benefit the students in universities itself will be a good thing. They have not fulfilled their burden of proving to us that these are very important elements to be considered for a public uni. Like literally, public unis are favored for their pricing, cheap pricings, and its quality. So we don't understand how, as a leading universities, public universities, this sort of power and influence within so many Malaysian students in the whole world, will that be a better world to live in when public universities handle their own financial audits as compared to governments and the countless reasons that we've told you in before speakers. So what is our burden on state government that we prove to you? We prove to you that governments telling unis what to do are way better. And what is the clash here? Three clashes. First, what is the purpose of a Ministry of Education? Second, what are the harms mutually exclusive? And third, who enables the drive of developing countries even more, which are utilitarian benefits? On to the principles. This means that MOE is responsible and accountable for how Malaysia grows as a nation. They have to fulfill the requirements to elevate ourselves to develop nation and pursuit of knowledge. I don't see how universities, as we characterize, as organizations who are very selfish, they only care about world university rankings. That they are very selfish also in terms of maintaining the quality for students, even though they have so much power and influence within them. As we have told you, the universities are more likely to only care for the years that they study in the uni itself, and they're more likely to be only catering to you in the university itself. As we've told you before, we offer degrees which are high ranking in public universities, but are not needed in the development of Malaysia. What does this mean? This means that the burden of finding employment is then pushed to the students eventually. Then now government can just wash their hands clean just because students are not getting jobs, and how we are complaining becomes a pressure to them. So how does government then prove to be a better arbitrator in fiscal policies? First, the pressure on government is huge because when people relate, public unis, they relate back to the government. Hence, when government does not fulfill the needs of people, especially the young people who are young graduates, they need the check and balance for voter bases. Hence, this means governments, when it comes to the understanding of how fiscal audits or which degrees are more needed in Malaysia, will then make a better choice. Second, are the harms mutually exclusive? What did they accuse us of doing? They said that unis' own methods to achieving their agendas is a better way to go. But we don't see no proof, no links, no importance as to why this is important in the debate. Second, they told us how unis submitting to the politics of government is far worse off in our case. But we tell you no. The universities are essentially a neutral institution. The universities then are obliged to cater to more students than it should be because it's then ruled by the government with the money that they spend. Third, they say that young people are not included in discussion. We see party politics in Malaysia that have included youth in many discussions like Khairi Jamaluddin, Mr. Syed Sadiq, and all these sort of people. And more so, the direct links of public uni to our students will then be able to cater the complaint directly to MOE itself. Hence, we find that this is a more effective way in announcing to students that the quality of education that they get and also the people that can get jobs guaranteed returns of their investments of government biology is an important subject as well. But it is not needed in Malaysia to further and elevate ourselves into a developed nation. Fourth, they say that we are seen as a way of getting more money from profit. First, financial prudence is a euphemism for the lack of outcome that they have not proven at all. Therefore, only in the speech we should come and prove to us like why we are going to prove your own thing. It's a bit too late. Second, as to why would investors buy shares for anything without any profit? So we can see the advantages of having government to be the arbitrator of audits here, as to how governments focus on the benefits of the people in Malaysia. They focus on the benefits and how people can pay tax to them. They focus on the people who can vote for them. These are the pressures that are absent when it comes to unis, public unis especially, being in the arbitrating process. When unis are already prided by their pricing and by their quality, or people will already join. So what is their incentive to maintain that quality of education is then questioned. Then third clash. And so who enables the drive of developing countries even more, which is the utilitarian benefit? I don't think they've told us anything about this here today. We have talked about how strategic developments are needed for Malaysia to be able to perform to be a developed nation. We mean the best for everyone. And we can only see governments doing this. When we talk about how public unis, they talk about how more expensive unis means more quality, and this is why more people are shifting to private unis. No, I think you're quite ignorant about the social strata and social economic status in most Malaysians in the world. That we depend on scholarships, that we depend on so many public uni entry levels to be able to have a cheaper uni degree and buy a quality one as well. Not all of us here can actually afford a private university degree, and it's growing so much in Malaysia that it's regrettable. Hence, when it comes to governments being the best arbitrator for the people to be able to get degrees when they offer these sort of processes. They ensure that you get a job. They ensure you get a paycheck, and they ensure you can feed your family later on. So when it comes to who then prepares a better world, we say that it's us, because more people achieving goals and better quality of life, people are better prepared in facilities that reflect the reality. Now universities or the government, they can employ lecturers that are more experienced in the working force and understand the nuances and data to suffice, and they have data to suffice to answer the questions how to improve the certain faculty or degree that is needed in Malaysia. We reduce the amount of brain drain, and hence this is the world that we want to live in to make Malaysia a better place. The contention is about how public universities have to maintain a sort of quality and affluence that they have in Malaysians' mindset. We have to maintain that sort of level because many Malaysians will eventually opt for these universities due to our socio-economic status. We cannot allow the poor to continue being poor. We cannot allow people to continue being ignorant about the realities of the world and not getting a job and not having money to feed their families with. Thank you.
Thank the government with. To conclude the substantive portions of this debate, let's invite opposition with. Here.
Ladies and gentlemen, the mere fact that you come and study here today means the Malaysian educational system is something that is way beyond catering for local necessities, but more importantly, they need to contribute as well. These are the bases to which, based on side position, and we gladly accept the premise of side government in today's debate that government does have an important role to play when it comes to discharging education out in discharge. We just don't think they should have a full autonomous power or control on how things are being done. I think we've made it perfectly clear that we are fine as having government as a as serving a complementary role when it comes to against those demands, right? Because to answer their question on what and how autonomous these universities look like, yeah, we think governments are still active stakeholders in this establishment. They are stakeholders, meaning their demands also will have to be pondered for at some point. So meaning, which the important thing to notice here is that it has to be a complementary team, but you don't have to be one imposing or being the alpha and omega of what university should be able to do, and that is what is problematic. Why? 3 issues that we're talking about. Firstly, on the idea of whether or not, firstly, on actually what are the roles of the Ministry of Higher Education and why it is actually important. On secondly, on whether or not the controls of universities actually better off under government control system or under a system where universities are quite autonomous. And lastly, the benefits we get on that side of the house, right? So exactly what are the roles of the Ministry of Higher Education? Within the Ministry of Higher Education itself is a government established body that is set to regulate and ensure the optimum best, to ensure the best possible outcomes from every Malaysian higher institutions, right? So meaning there's already a state invested in there. Meaning if universities, if the problem they have is that universities won't be able to universities won't be able to buy into their strategy of prioritizing certain demands and stuff like that. Things such as even losing their licenses from the Ministry of Education are things they want risking on the side of the house because they are not relevant anymore as an educational institution, right? But secondly, right, and beyond that, right, we see the goal of the Malaysian Higher Education Ministry is set to ensure that Malaysian schools are the best kind of schools that are available, not just to the rakyat in Malaysia, but even how these rakyats are like global market system, or to the to local market system, or to global in entirely. Right? So why are these things important? Right? Because we think all these things are solely reliant on huge financial capability, right? So this means we have to continually need to put pressure on government. It is strictly reliant on funding from government, right? So the sole dependency intensive what the kind of how government cater to this particular incentive, right? Because you continue the demand is something that is not stopping, it's something that is everly increasing, right? Meaning government will have to continue to always pump more and more money into the system, right? So meaning the more money you pump into the system, the more of other opportunity costs and things you get on this side of the house, right? Which is why what Eric told you in his speech is as vastly important as possible, right? Because when universities are able to ease this burden to this financial burden of government to some extent, it means as a developing nation developing economy that Malaysia is today, you have more money to invest in other things which are actually beneficial to you as a nation. But let's move on into this idea of control. Right? On which side is control better? Right? Well, there are two issues in this argument. Right? Firstly, control itself. Right? What does government control look like? Because they've been portraying government as this arbitrary organization, as selfless organization that just gives things without a string, right? We tell you this is not true, right? When you're solely reliant on government, right? This is where you now have things you don't want to be having in Malaysia education system, which I don't want to be talking about. But to look into more productive, censoring speeches on campus, having to define some kind of political ideologies that needed to be run on campuses and ignoring other systems. These are things that are extremely harmful within the educational system, right? So we think government. But what if we have other stakeholders involved? Because they asked us, what are the incentives of our private stakeholders, right? We'll tell you it's simple. It's very simple. Return of investment, right? As a stakeholder investing in something, you are probably the organization hiring students from these institutions, right? Meaning you want as much innovative system coming into your system as possible, right? So they cannot just say, it's only government that is so interested in terms of innovation and stuff like that. We tell you these are incentives that are free and diverge from all political pollutions that exist within Malaysian university campuses. Today, right? For secondly, on the idea of resources distribution, because they said the only incentive of universities when universities have control is they want to fund out for war ranking and things like that. We tell you this is
Speaker, if the debate boils down to who can get better education, unfortunately on your side, you have to cater to students, the private investors, the government body, and the job stream. How would you do it?
It's also what the universities actually prioritize, right? Because they said, what ranking? What ranking is actually a good thing because the criteria my LO gave you on how what ranking works is because it's not just necessarily that you are an institution delivering education or educating people. No, it has to be how employable your youth are, how good they are, how innovative they are. Meaning, this is one more incentive universities have to push their students, and this is what we see in vastly majority of developed world today, when they heavily invest in the ability of their students to be innovative, creating beauties, because this is why you as the universities as well are profitable because they monetize all these things, and these are the form of return of investment for these universities to even be more autonomous, right? So lastly, in terms of benefit, we think these are things that are actually even vastly beneficial to the rakyat in general if you are not limited into the bubble of the little restricted resources that government is funding you for educating them under a system that is free from any form of barrier. Never been prouder.
Is there an opposition whip? May we invite the opposition reply? Here.
two things in this speech. Firstly, the process by which we actually become financially autonomous. And why we think that means that the push is something that is worth supporting. And then secondly, I'm going to engage with why we think we get better education and the quality of education we get on both sides. Right, so on the first issue. So I think motion expects us to support the push to actually ensure that these universities are financially autonomous. That means that all the wealth of prioritization we've got so far about how universities in status quo aren't exactly the most prudent financially is extremely important. Especially when you need to consider the fact that it then comes at the cost of a government having to then take the cost of actually the lack of prudency by these universities. That means on this side of the house, the context they set up is a world in which the government actually needs to engage with a failing economy and an economy that isn't doing too well. That's the context they gave us from PM. That then means that if there's anything you ought to do to cut costs, is to ensure that that prudency is something that is solved. I don't think many of these universities are going to be exactly financially autonomous just in the next few years. In fact, maybe some of them might feel from time to time I might need some government funding to actually support as complementary. I still think that that push and to ensure that many of these universities are exactly financially prudent is something that is still good in itself. And I think that's enough to win this debate. So two things here. Secondly, I think universities are more likely to be lax on this side of the house and not go for the sort of things that we think are important in many of these universities. That means that you're more likely to have a continuation of nepotism on this side, the continuation of just employing people because you know them, or employing them because you think that this is just free money that you can give to this person because now the government will subsidize it at the end of the day. I think that these are things that are extremely important to cut down, and that's why Alex couldn't just say that there wasn't any analysis, because this was the analysis of that argument. Secondly, how about the quality of education and why we get better quality on our side? I think even if we concede in this debate what Mission wanted us to concede, that you're going to have a slight increase in fees, I still think we win in this debate. Why is that the case? Because the context I gave you in my speech, that these universities are still going to operate as non-profit means, that slight increase in fees isn't exactly going, that increase in fees isn't going to be one that is massive and enough to actually chase people out of many of these universities. If you still buy their premise again, that the economy isn't doing too well, I think that slight increase in fees is something that is justified in itself. That in combination with the fact that you're more likely to be prudent, that means you don't get wasted resources on our side of the house. But what's important is that universities are then forced to attract students because now they have to balance their budgets. And now that means that they have to actually attract students because that is one of the major sources of actually getting any income on their side, on our side of the house. That means that universities are definitely forced to innovate and do things that will actually mean that you get more students. That's why within Malaysian education system, a lot of people would rather get loans and go to private institutions because they feel that they're more likely to actually get the best of education or more likely to actually be employable on that side. I think that is important because on this side of the house, you have a university that is lax, and that means even if you definitely give people low funding and get them into those schools, you don't get people that are actually highly employable or get a university that's actually incentivized in making sure things are done well. But lastly, independence. I think independence is extremely important in this debate, given the wealth of analysis we got from Sadiq just now and all the various examples that he gave to you. Because note, on this side, the government is definitely going to be asking for things in return for many of this funding that is given. That means you have a more on a scale, a university that is more reliant on this government funding and can actually do things that they deem to be actually right. That means even the argument of youth actually being not feeling like they're getting any change is more likely on your side, because when student bodies rally for something, university says no because they can't do it now, the government is actually giving them these resources. I think your university is more likely to be independent, and that independence means that you're likely to get more innovative change. You should be proud of this.
We thank the opposition reply. To conclude this debate, let's invite the government reply. Here.
Yes. Nitty-gritty things, 3 questions. First thing, a budget deficit coupled with an increase in fees. Don't buy the euphemism, there'll be a slight increase. These slight increases don't change anything. We agree, and you have to make a trade-off in this debate. There'll be a significant increase in the fees. And especially if you're going to hold us to our promise that it is time we'll be doing a budget deficit. My PM Evan told you that we're doing an economic crisis, budget deficits happen. You pick and choose when you want to debate your debate, you won't win it. Secondly, most funny thing ever, you'll be more independent. Now, on your side, you have the government, you have public, you have private bodies, you have independent donors for your student projects, you have the job market, and you have the students. Where's the independence here? When you just increase the number of parties that put their hand into your bowl and dictate how the university should go. Like, honestly, I think at least just having the government, and this is where the bulk of my analysis went unnegated. Governments are accountable to the people because they continuously want to get voted back in. That means they have to ensure some level of happiness to ensure that they get maintained in power. That means there is more accountability on our side in comparison to yours, and you do not win that. Lastly, Speaker recognized that there was a change across the bank, where the first speaker was up for full-on privatization and never talked about how governments maintain some level of power. Second speaker changed that and said there'll be increase in power. Third speaker said that he really didn't know what he wanted. I need to be, to make this a clearer debate, you needed to make sure that if you're going to privatize it all the way, or you're going to have some halfway thing, explain this hybrid. Because leaving this hybrid here leaves many doubts in the minds of the judges, whereas we were very clear from the get-go. Full control of the government, except for the syllabus. What we meant by that is like, if they chose to buy books from LSE or UCL, it's up to the university to choose how they want to lecture, right? But how the budgets happen is in control with us. What are the three questions that I'll be moving on to? Firstly, who gives more benevolent funding? Because this is the primary clash that we want to clash. Secondly, where should the money really go? Because they suggest that private investors are very benevolent to do this as a form of CSR. We don't think that's true. Lastly, what was their policy and why they do not win? First question, who gives more benevolent funding? They say that private universities would use this as a form of CSR, and in their worst case, there'll be some increase in payment. We don't think this is true. We think private universities, especially as a university who's shedding shares and have shareholders to oblige to, and have responsibilities, and have a bigger metric of how much money we need to achieve by the end of a fiscal year, we think that if anything, you need to circumvent something and you need to reduce on something. You cannot say, I want to have my cake and eat it too. You cannot say there'll still be low fees, there'll still be good education, there'll still be some form of autonomy. We were willing to trade off one thing very clear. We were willing to trade off like more money for welfare, healthcare, and other things we could have gone to, and we were happy to prioritize education because we think education is the most important thing in Malaysia today, right? Especially as a developing nation, referred to my first minutes of my speech, right? But more importantly, what you guys did miss, right, is that besides being confusing, on the second question, where should the money really go? You say that money will oftentimes not be prudent. We think if your calculation is during a budget deficit, the things are more often than not as prudent as possible. We think that it's unfortunate that our hands are strapped. So we think that at the status quo right now, the budget allocation is as effective as possible. You never showed us how you make it more effective. Lastly, what was their policy and why we win? We win because, number one, we actually had a principal argumentation on how states have better information and need to use the information power. We had no principal response to that. I think we win the principal debate. On the practical, at the very least we were clearer, but at the very most we had a policy that would continuously work, where we told you that there is a symbiosis between students and the government, and as well as the teachers in the university. How students can now be more vocal in the political arena, because it was to brush off the students will do it anyway. This is called a comparative, where students more vocal on our side, where politicians more interested to hear on our side. And at the end of the day, we take this debate supremely proud to propose.
We thank both teams for the excellent debate. Both teams may now cross the floor and hands for judges for these to deliberate.